What's the biggest trap for an orchestra conductor? Can orchestras show us how to be a good community? Welcome to Music Un-Tuxed. Today's special guest is my friend Thor Sigurdsson, a cellist, bassist, and conductor who I met over 40 years ago at the Juilliard School. In this episode, Thor starts off by telling us there's only one kind of music. Listen in to find out more.
There's only one kind of music, and that's the music that makes you feel good. So I happen to believe that classical music is a community-minded activity or community-minded art form. And for me personally, the heart and soul of my career was in the orchestral profession, which is really a microcosm of what a community is. So when you think about communities and how they interact with one another, the one word that always comes to mind is cooperation. How do people get things done together as a team? Because if everybody works disparately in their own way, then they end up having less efficiency and less effectiveness in what they're trying to accomplish. It's when people cooperate and stop fighting and become more of a cohesive unit that real progress can take place. And I happen to feel very strongly that being in an orchestra gives us the opportunity, both as players and as audience members, to witness the power of real cooperation. So when you're with a professional orchestra, as I was fortunate to be with for about 20 years, I was able to witness how people can all contribute something to the whole. So the one thing you realize as an orchestra player is that you're just one part of it. And especially in a string section as a cellist. So when you're in a string section, everybody's generally playing the same music at the same time. And it requires a tremendous amount of humility and a sense of the wonder of how people play exactly together. When you first start doing it as a young player, as a youth orchestra member, you're puzzled. How is it that we're all playing exactly at the same time? And then as you get better and better, you realize you become more and more acclimated to the magic that takes place within an ensemble. And you realize that it's because everybody has set aside their own personal opinion about something in favor of the group opinion. You're developing a group mentality, which can be very positive and fulfilling. There is also being a soloist, and being a soloist can be very fulfilling as well. But even soloists need to collaborate with somebody at some point, unless they only play by themselves, which of course can happen. There is solo music, which I love to do as well.
I see you have your cello.
Yeah, I have my cello to play a little Bach for you at some
Excellent.
point.
Now that's some solo music.
But one of the reasons why community music is possible is an important word, and that is rhythm. If everybody understands rhythm, then that is the common denominator, the glue, so to speak, that keeps everyone together. It's more than that, but without rhythm, if it ain't got that swing, they don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, which is another way of saying rhythm. You got to feel the rhythm together. You have to have a similar pulse going through your bodies as kind of a denominator to keep everybody together. That's the essence of what I feel is a community, or the model of a community is an ensemble like an orchestra or a string quartet that feels rhythm together and therefore can express art in a very cohesive way.
I guess it's almost like the term vibing together.
Yes.
Vibrations or rhythm. That term is actually a real universal thing. Because speaking of which, you mentioned rhythm in the orchestra, everyone's feeling it together. And universally, the universe wouldn't be working without rhythm.
That's right. That's right. And yet it's surprising sometimes how little people do think about it sometimes outside of music. In other words, when you're just going to the office or walking down the street or driving in traffic, it is very tempting to forget that there are people all agreeing to follow traffic laws in order to be able to share the same road without crashing into each other.
Yeah.
So
So
Go ahead.
you mentioned, okay, so you immediately went into the orchestra realm, which you were in one orchestra for 20 years, which is quite a long time to form that community. And now you're also forging out and being a conductor. And I know I want to know how that feels and what you believe in as the role of the conductor, because many times, myself somewhat included, that there can be like quite an there's that joke about the horns
Yep.
and the butt,
The horn joke.
the
We're going to
horn,
leave it as the horn joke. It's a
the
little off
horn.
color. Yep. That's a great joke. But the difference for me between understanding a conductor as someone who shows you when to play, which is what most people would assume.
Mm-hmm.
What does the conductor do? The conductor shows you when to play. That's the last thing they do, actually. The most important thing that they do is they express a vision of the future. Mm-hmm. They are never, ever conducting. A real sincere conductor is never supposed to be conducting what the orchestra is playing. Ever. They're always trying to conduct what the orchestra is about to play, what is about to happen. That sense of planning and that sense of true leadership, because the leadership, the essence of the word leadership to me is vision, having a vision for the future, being able to understand the environment that you're in. What skill level does this orchestra have? Not every orchestra has the same skill level. So you have to understand the skill level of the orchestra. You have to understand, is it cold out? Are people, did they have to drive through a snowstorm to get to this rehearsal or this concert? What are the circumstances that these people are dealing with? The environment. Mm-hmm. And lastly, do they know you? Are they familiar with you, or are you a total stranger to them? Mm-hmm. So the familiarity that the conductor has with an orchestra can very much affect their ability to communicate well. The hardest part of being a conductor, in my opinion, is falling into the trap. The trap is, I am in control of these people. So that's a trap. So you played in a string quartet, I played in a string quartet, and everybody that's played in chamber music without a conductor knows that at any given moment, every member of that ensemble is going to be the leader. So it's not like there's ever one singular leader. Now, when things start to go wrong, people generally look to the first violin for guidance. But sometimes the first violinist isn't playing. And so the first violinist will give a look, I'm sure you have at some point, like, why are you looking at me? So the deal is that when you're in an ensemble, like an orchestra, you are in a string quartet. And that's what differentiates a good orchestra from a great orchestra. A great orchestra truly is playing like a string quartet, but it is a string quartet that requires leadership. And that's the element that the conductor brings to it. The leadership that the orchestral conductor brings to the equation is one of knowledge of the score, incredible knowledge of the score, and a knowledge of the possibilities of what can happen and what should happen. Because sometimes a piece will start off a little slower than maybe it ought to have, and then the possibilities have changed. But if it starts off at a faster tempo, now the possibilities are vastly different. So it's very much a dance, or if you will, of deciding, being a conductor, deciding what's possible and what is a good idea. So, because sometimes what's possible is a bad idea. Right. So you don't always, you can see what's possible, but that's not necessarily going to be a good idea at that moment. So you have to see what's possible and what really is the right idea that should be pursued. And then to make a command decision. Because every orchestra can tell when a conductor doesn't really know what they want and is just wondering what's going to happen. That conductor is very clear. And that conductor is actually sometimes very successful because they're showing with a beat and they're just very predictable. But you can sense that they really don't know what's supposed to be happening musically, where the direction of the phrase is, what is truly possible. What sort of a vision does that person have?
In addition to having that community of the orchestra, you are involved in a community too. You are representing a community that orchestra is in. So they have all these conductors today coming into various cities, and there's a conductor for different orchestras. That city identifies with that orchestra like a sports team.
I would agree.
So that conductor actually has a much larger job than specifically the orchestra.
Oh, absolutely. So
Yeah.
now you're talking about outside of performance.
Yes.
I would definitely agree that an orchestral conductor who's considered a music director, someone who's at the top of the totem pole, so to speak, who only answers to the board of directors, they have the opportunity to go out into the community and represent the orchestra and to represent the community. That Royal Oak, where I'm conducting right now, which is a beautiful community on the northern suburb of Detroit, is an incredibly vibrant community, which I'm only beginning to know. I would never pretend to know what it's like to live there. I've never lived in Royal Oak. But as a conductor, should I be given the helm of the orchestra as music director, which I'm in contention for, then I will very much be pursuing individual businesses within the community, civic groups. I'm going to be the person that shows up to the book club and shows up to these other civic opportunities to get people together and find out what makes them tick, what makes these organizations successful or not successful. Mm-hmm. So, because everybody wants to be successful, right? No one wants to be a failure. Everyone wants to do well, and everyone wants to feel like they're having an impact on the community, including the Royal Oak Symphony. So the Royal Oak Symphony is simply a microcosm, as you said, of the community, of the greater community. That's one of the cool things about an orchestra, is it can be seen as almost a model for how things can work and how people can address dysfunction, how people can address political dysfunction. Sometimes political dysfunction can be very painful, especially in today's environment.
Yes.
So we're all trying our best to figure out how to get along with people that we don't necessarily agree with. You don't have to agree with somebody to get along with them. The number of times I've disagreed with a conductor's opinions is too many to count. But I go with it because I realize quickly that there is much more to be gained from being a team player rather than asserting my own individual will on the cello section. So now, when the conductor conducts in a very ineffective way, which does happen from time to time, as a principal cellist, I will assert my feelings on something. And I'll notice the conductor, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they'll turn and it's almost like they're reacting like, oh, listen to the cellos. That's wonderful. That might even be what I intended, which is, of course, not true. But they want to feel like they're involved and they're still leading this thing. So a lot of times, Chris, if they're the right combination of personalities and the right chemistry, they can come together in a way that makes the conductor look even better than they deserve to be looked upon. Right. And that does happen. In a community, same thing, right? A business can represent the community in a way that maybe is better than the community deserves sometimes. In other words, they try to be real civic leaders. They try to show up and really show enthusiasm, but there are not a lot of other people who are showing enthusiasm. And so they have to go, that's just the way it is. And they go from there.
So your orchestra, the orchestra that you're in contention for the conductor position, that's fantastic, by the way. I wish you the best. And I'm sure they will be very fortunate if they select you. And is it a community orchestra? Are they filled with professionals?
No, it's filled with all volunteers.
Okay, so talk about community. This is really true.
Yeah.
It's truly a community orchestra. So you may have people in the orchestra that own the local delicatessen that could
That's
come
correct.
in.
That's correct.
That is great.
It is great. And so in that sense, it is absolutely what you said. These are not people whose sole role is to perform in an orchestra. Their primary role is to work in an office or to work in a store or to work in a restaurant or work in a library. But the one thing that they do share is a love for music and a love for the musical community that an orchestra represents.
With the community orchestra, do they audition for the orchestra?
Yes, they do.
And so this is going to bring my next topic up about building community, or is this breaking down community? do they audition with a screen in front of them? And what is your...
I don't know for sure about the screen, but I'm relatively positive that this orchestra does not involve a screen.
Mhm.
What they do is they encourage potential candidates to become members of the orchestra by watching a video of themselves performing, because I think they more value the person playing at their peak potential rather than at that very moment what happens to come out. So as everybody knows, when you play with it in front of a video camera, you can do as many takes as you want. You don't have to do just one take. So you can, if you don't like the performance you gave, you stop it, you start over, and you can do it over and over again until you find something that you really feel good about. And that is what this orchestra wants. They want to see someone who feels that they're demonstrating to the audition committee their very best work. And sometimes being in a very stressful situation like an orchestral audition can show the worst. It can actually be backfire. So we have to be human beings. And I wish this were more like the orchestral profession of the professional auditions, but that's just not the way it is. They have the screens. It's much more of a pressure cooker situation. Having said that, the next step after they pass the video round is they are invited to sit in with the orchestra. And so that's another really positive way of identifying whether a person is going to be a positive element, add a positive vibe to the orchestra, or create maybe a possibly negative vibe within the section. So it requires a lot of empathy for the people, because everybody wants to be, no one would apply to play with an amateur orchestra unless they really wanted to do it. There's no one saying, I've got to make a living. No, this is all about performing because you love music and you love being a part of something. And so there are some people who have very limited technical resources at their disposal, but their attitudes are so positive and they're so driven to have results in the final analysis that you're willing to overlook some of their technical deficiencies in favor of that. Similarly, you could have someone who is incredibly technically proficient, but just demonstrates a general arrogance or a general obstinance to being a part of something. And similarly, that person can be looked upon as maybe a less desirable candidate, even though they're a very fine player. The expression that comes to mind is prima donna. No one wants to sit next to a prima donna.
You and I have both sat under conductors that have had that ego that can squelch. And it seems like this position in the community orchestra that it is in Royal Oak, it seems like there are many different facets to your direction towards the musicians, being that they're not necessarily privy to all the technical, like you don't have people that can just come in and play all over the place. There's an added challenge in a way. It's probably excitement.
An opportunity. Yeah.
An opportunity. Yes.
I'll be honest with you. I thought about early in my career whether I wanted to pursue professional conducting. And it became clear as I became stronger and stronger as an orchestral player, that was not what I really wanted to do, because so much of the orchestral profession is really a sense of just staying out of the way. Now, having said that, believe me, I have more respect than anyone for conductors. They're amazingly wonderful artists, and they deserve the respect that they have earned. But I will also say that when I'm conducting a community orchestra, those people are not asking you to stay out of the way. They want you to be as involved as humanly possible. Now, does that mean micromanaging? Yes, it does. Micromanaging is something that professional musicians, orchestral musicians do not want. They don't want to be micromanaged. They want to be entrusted that they're able to stay together on their own. All they need is the big picture vision to show what's possible artistically. Now, with a community orchestra, they want that too, but they also want to be spoken to as a student would, as a teacher would speak to a student. This is the way I believe it should be. And this is how I think you can get it. If you all put your bow a little closer to the frog for this particular moment, and then lean forward for the beginning of the note and use as much vibrato as possible, there's going to be a tremendous outflowing of emotion on this note. And I've noticed that maybe there could be a few people that are using a little less bow than they ought to be using here, or they're starting a little bit too far away from the frog. Yeah. So something like that. And it's very important not to offend people. So rather than saying, I noticed are not using enough bow. So you can't single out people, but you can speak very directly to them because they want that. They hunger for that. Yes. Because they're not there to earn money. They're not there to be told that they're great. That's I think a lot of professional conductors spend a lot of time telling audiences and musicians how great that orchestra is. That's part of the job. Part of the job of being an orchestral professional conductor is complimenting musicians. And I think amateur musicians want to feel like they're doing a good job, but they also want to feel like they're getting sincere constructive criticism as much as possible. There's not one person sitting there, you know what, you're so full of yourself, we don't need you, we can play this by ourselves. There's not one person in the orchestra that feels that way. Right. So now, does that mean that the conductor of an amateur orchestra can be full of themselves? Sure, they can. That's a mistake. Right. So you have to have humility, but you also have to have a sense of believing that these individual players out there are looking for instruction, that they're looking for clear, concise instruction. Sorry for the dogs.
What's your dog? Okay, tell us the dog's name.
The one that's barking is a dandelion, and my son doesn't realize that I'm online right now. So that's the problem. Yeah, otherwise he would be controlling her. Got it. She's a very sweet dog, and she will give up eventually. But let it suffice to say that I look forward to every opportunity I have with the Royal Oak to talk about the style of the Brahms symphony we're playing. The Fourth Symphony of Brahms is a really difficult piece. And a lot of players in that orchestra look at each other and say, are we really up to this task? Is this really something that's... And the answer is, we do our best to find out. The way you may answer that question is by trying it. Right. You don't ask yourself answer that question by saying, maybe some other time. No. So I believe very much in this orchestra's abilities. And sometimes you have to believe in it a little more than maybe they believe it themselves. Yeah.
So here you are, you're conducting, you're building community with a community orchestra, and you were playing in an orchestra, same orchestra in Florida for 20 years. You were also in the New World Symphony in Miami and did all these transitions in your career. And I believe you even had to learn bass in order to...
Well, I learned bass because I wanted to learn bass. I thought about being able to teach the bass, and I thought before I can teach it, I ought to learn to play it. So I got myself a bass, and I spent a couple of years really sincerely practicing every day, taking lessons from a Chicago Symphony bass player, and was very fortunate to have that opportunity and that I was able to do that and follow through and succeed at that. So I got pretty good pretty quickly. In retrospect, I'm thinking, man, if I could do it all over again, maybe I would have started on bass. Who knows? Wow. Because the bass is a wonderful instrument. But
you certainly have the size for the bass.
It is. I'm sure a tall person.
I know there's small bassists as well.
Right. No, there are people with very small hands to play the bass. It's true. But to make a long story short, I enjoyed it enough where when I got to Ann Arbor, I finally ended up auditioning for and becoming the principal bass of a community orchestra here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I did that for 2 years, or a year and a half, actually, before I finally decided to move on to other things. But I got so much out of that. It was such a positive experience. Again, all amateurs, all really sincere people who wanted to do well, but some whose techniques were not as advanced as others.
Okay, so I want to know something about the difference. So we were just talking about the rhythm earlier and how vibing and rhythm is essentially break it down or build it up and it becomes vibrations. And the vibrations with the bass are much different than with the cello.
Yes.
So can you just give us a little bit of an experience?
It takes more physical commitment to be successful at the bass. It takes more physical commitment on the cello than the violin. Right. So the violin has much more of a direct response than the cello and the bass. The larger the instrument, the slower the response. That's a physical reality. So to encourage bass players to play on the edge of the beat what they perceive to be the edge of the beat, and to encourage the violins to not play on the edge of the beat.
Right.
Because to have the violins ahead of the basses, there's nothing that sounds more lopsided.
Yeah, yeah.
Basses lead the ensemble in terms of the direction of the sound is really important. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk just a little bit about the conducting gesture. When you think of a gesture, there's the up part, and then it goes down, and then it bounces off this invisible thing, causing a thing called an ictus. And that pulsation that happens there means something completely different to a professional orchestra than it does to an amateur orchestra. Mm-hmm. And that's a really important thing that I've been trying to impart very gradually and very subtly, sometimes less subtly than others, to the Royal Oak Symphony members, is that they are so wanting to play that they can't even wait to get to the bottom before they play. Sometimes they play early because they're so anxious, and it's understandable. That's understandable reality. But the fact is that when they realize that they don't need to do that, and that they can play after the beat, and actually I suggest that it's the rebound of the rebound. So there's the rebound, and then there's this invisible table up here. This is where you play. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, 2. So the idea that, yeah, that's something that is trained. That is not something that is obvious to anyone. It wasn't obvious to me as a youth orchestra member, because youth orchestras also want to play so close to the beat that they actually end up playing before the beat because they're anxious. And that anxiety that causes them to do that is understandable, but it's also addressable. You can address that anxiety and say, everybody, lay back and feel the pulse together, and realize that what I'm showing is the essence of what's possible, as opposed to I'm not dictating rhythm to the. Now, if I conduct like this, clearly this is where you're going to play 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you do this, it's very different for a professional orchestra than for an amateur orchestra. And I very much value that amateur orchestras need to be trained very gently and very organically into that mindset of waiting for the right moment to play.
So I want to get back just briefly about the question about the cello and the bass. Do you feel differently playing the bass than you do with the cello?
Oh, very much.
Does it like resonate in your body differently?
Well, yeah, it does. It does. Mostly it's just physically painful.
Oh, really?
Because even though I'm playing an instrument that's very similar to the cello, the effort of pushing the string to the fingerboard or pulling it should be pulling instead of pushing. That activity requires more than twice as much physical effort as the cello. And I've often remarked to myself after in a rehearsal with the orchestra I played with in Ann Arbor, picking up the cello, oh man, it messes with my cello technique big time. Oh, really? It makes me feel very tired and a little, not injured necessarily, hopefully not injured, but definitely feeling fatigued. The fatigue of playing the bass is intense.
Right.
And it's not surprising when I hear that bass players often have physical problems in terms of their shoulders, is because of that physical reality of how difficult it is. So I'm assuming there's a similarity between violin and viola.
A little bit.
Violas tend to have more arm challenges than violinists.
I actually feel good going back to the violin. It always feels very comfortable.
Oh, yeah, that's good. That's good.
Like I'm on a little mini instrument. I can drive it around. It's like going from my SUV back to my little Chevy Volt. I think, and I can zoom around a little more easily. But and definitely not nearly as extreme. I've tried playing a bass, and it's just, for me, I get way too caught up doing the pizzicato. I love that, and then I end up getting a big blister on my finger, and it just gets way too out of hand. But just getting that string to resonate, wow.
Yeah.
And then the feeling, though, it really, you can feel that in your belly much more than the other instrument. Yeah. So so this conducting is very exciting, and you're truly passionate about it. And there's many ways it seems like the community orchestra is really just that. It's community.
It is.
And not only within the orchestra, but within the extended community, and how the conductor's involvement in it is much different than that of a professional orchestra.
It can be. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's really neat.
It is neat. Yeah.
I'd love to just hear about a few of your other ventures as well.
Yeah, I'm on the verge of starting a very important project here in Ann Arbor, the Haydn Seek Chamber Music Academy. So this is an opportunity for mostly adults, but also some kids to come together and read music, again, at varying levels of technical proficiency, trying to encourage people to use chamber music as a therapy for life. Because, and then that's not the only reason to do it, of course, but it is it's one of the real true benefits, is that when you're in a room with people playing music, everyone just generally feels so happy to be there and to be a part of this thing, which is life-changing after all, because it only happens one time. The performance you're hearing, I mean, you could record it and listen to it, I suppose, but barring that, it's happening right at this moment, and it's never going to happen again exactly the same way. It's a really cool experience of how to get along with people, but also how to enjoy an art form of music as a group, as opposed to just as oneself.
Now, if we could just have our world leaders sit down in a string quartet together and make music.
Yeah,
a lot of things would, and like you just said, though, it is a magical thing. We all come together in that music making realm and are feeling it and creating something that we cannot do singularly.
Amen, brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's definitely very frustrating to imagine any of our world leaders sitting down in a string quartet. It's hard to imagine.
I actually think it's a beautiful thing to imagine. It's frustrating to imagine to actually think that it could happen. But wow, I don't. Yeah,
I agree with you. I agree with you. We agree. So anyway, we're staying away from that subject too much. I believe that chamber music has an incredible, aside from just the shared skills of being able to play your instrument at the same time, which involves rhythm, pulse, and technical proficiency, being able to play a note in tune generally. So there's a lot of skills involved, which it is a joy to witness someone else sharing their similar skills that you have.
Right.
Oh, you can do that too? That's great. As opposed to, I thought I was the only one that could do it. I think there's a much more common thing is adults getting together in a rock band and playing music that they know and maybe jamming, but there's that sense of the drums keeping everybody together. And that is a little bit like, in my mind, not cheating, but it's an unfair comparison, because when you have a drum set player, everyone is falling in line under the drums.
It's so much easier. I know, it's great.
When you play a string quartet, it is much harder. Now, when you have a piano, the piano is like a drum set.
Right.
So the piano, as long as the pianist has a decent amount of skill in terms of being able to hold to a pulse, to a tempo, which some pianists are better than others at that. Yeah. But the fact is that there is a sense with the piano, the percussive quality, that it's like a drum set a little bit.
Yeah. So the Haydn Seek project, building community with chamber music, adults, all levels, kids as well. It sounds incredible, Thor. And now you have your cello. And you mentioned Bach, and Bach is, let's give that guy a shout out to being universal, intergalactic.
Let me go ahead and move my camera a little further away so you can get a better of the cello. So this is a cello I've been fortunate to own for about the better part of 2 years. And it was made, the top, the back, and the skull were made in 1650 by a man named Antonio Cassini. So I think this cello was made before Bach was born, but most of it.
Yeah.
And I play on a hill bow. So it's a very nice cello and bow combination. I'm going to play just a little bit of I'm going to play the Sarabande from Suite Number 5 for unaccompanied cello.
Give us a little bit about what this does for you.
It is, first of all, I think one of the most unusual pieces because it's the only sarabande of the 6 suites that has no chords in it, no double stops. For people that don't know what that means playing 2 notes at the same time. That's a double stop. When we string players perform single line melodies, it is implied harmony when we're playing by ourselves because there's no accompaniment. So Bach has done an amazing thing with this particular sarabande in giving us a melody that is so harmonically interesting and so harmonically rich that it doesn't need chords. It doesn't. It's perfect. It's really one of the perfect pieces for cello, and it also, I think, one of the saddest pieces ever written for the cello. And that's just my opinion. Some people might find it very uplifting, and I would love them to feel uplift and comfort from it. I don't think it's a depressing piece at all, but I think it's a piece that has some very deep, dark emotions. And it is a sense that everything has cohesiveness to it, that life is not about trying to force yourself onto something, but just to let life discover itself for what it is. That sounds a little bit too esoteric maybe, but that this piece has a real sense of resignation, that everything is the way, resignation, that everything is the way it is, and that we just let things be the way they're going to be and not try to force ourselves on them.
So that's what it's doing for you.
That's what it's doing for me. Yep.
That's what it's doing for you. Well,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you've been incredible.
Thank you.
I love your presence, love being with you, and thank you today, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's exciting, and I look forward to speaking with you on many other occasions.
And stay un-tuxed.
I will stay un-tuxed. Absolutely. There's no tux here.